This story is a work of historical fiction, inspired by real-life settings of the 1800s in North Carolina. While certain events, places, and cultural details are drawn from history, the characters, dialogues, and specific incidents are fictionalized for dramatic storytelling. Any resemblance to real persons or families is purely coincidental. The purpose of this narrative is entertainment and historical exploration, not an exact factual account. The year was 1839, and the Carolina sun carried both warmth and burden upon the fields of tobacco and cotton that stretched as far as the eye could wander. In a quiet hamlet tucked along the Neuse River, life unfolded in the steady rhythm of farmhands rising before dawn, wagons creaking along dirt roads, and the faint toll of a church bell that commanded the hearts of even the most wayward souls. It was here, in a small, weathered farmhouse shaded by sycamore trees, that two girls came into the world, identical twins, born to a family already struggling to make ends meet. The people of the town whispered of the girls even in their infancy, not out of malice but fascination. 2 drops from the same cup, an elderly midwife had muttered when she first held them, swaddled in linen. Their names were Mary and Martha, and from their very first cries, it seemed they belonged not only to each other, but to a fate larger than the narrow world around them. The sisters grew quickly, their lives a mirror of each other's, and yet, as the seasons passed, their differences revealed themselves in quiet but certain ways. Mary, the elder by only minutes, had a stillness to her, an inwardness, as if her thoughts never rested. Martha, by contrast, carried laughter easily and chased through the fields barefoot, her hair tangled with wildflowers. But though their personalities diverged, they were bound in ways that no ordinary siblings could ever understand. When one fell ill, the other felt the fever. When one wept, the other tasted the salt of tears upon her lips, though she had shed none herself. North Carolina in those years was not a forgiving place. Families lived off the land, and fortunes were determined by the yield of the soil, the weather's mercy, and the back-breaking labor that never truly ceased. Their father, a farmer of modest means, worked long hours with hands rough as bark. Their mother carried her own quiet sorrow. For 6 children she had buried before the twins ever drew breath. Thus, Mary and Martha were not simply daughters. They were living proof that life sometimes relented, if only briefly, to grant a fragile gift. The town itself was small enough that everyone knew of the sisters. In church, they sat side by side, their hymn voices weaving as one, causing even the minister to falter at times. At the market, buyers marveled at how one could not be told apart from the other, save for the faint scar above Mary's brow from a childhood tumble. And as the years drew them into womanhood, their beauty became a subject of endless speculation. Suitors traveled farther than usual just for a chance to meet the famed twin blossoms of Carolina, as one poet foolishly called them. Yet, for all the attention, the sisters remained guarded, even secretive, as if they knew that choosing love meant choosing division. By their 17th year, the household bore new burdens. Their father's health had begun to fail, leaving more of the plowing and tending to fall upon his daughter's shoulders. They did not complain. Labor was as familiar to them as prayer. But the whispers of neighbors grew sharper. 2 young women working fields alone were seen as vulnerable, and men of dubious intentions began circling like vultures. One evening, after a long day of reaping, the sisters sat by the riverbank, their reflections dancing in the water. Martha broke the silence first. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "if the Lord made us the same so that we would never be apart? So that no man could take one and leave the other?" Mary stared at their faces rippling side by side. "Or perhaps he made us the same so that we would be tested, to see which of us the world would favor more." It was an answer that unsettled Martha, though she said nothing. Somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called, and the shadows of dusk swallowed their conversation whole. In that same year, the town welcomed a new figure, Jonathan Hale, a man whose arrival would prove to alter the course of the twins' lives beyond recognition. He was not from their county but from further inland, a man of sturdy build with ambitions that reached further than farming alone. He came under the guise of trade, but soon his reputation for charm and eloquence preceded him. Some said he could talk a bird from a tree. Others claimed he had eyes that saw through a person's soul. The first time Jonathan met the sisters was at Sunday service. He had paused at the chapel doors, struck by the sight of two young women whose likeness seemed otherworldly. His eyes lingered longer than was proper, and when the hymns rose that morning, his gaze scarcely left their pew. Mary noticed it first, the weight of his attention, and felt a strange unease coil inside her. Martha, on the other hand, felt her heart leap with a mixture of curiosity and delight. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan's presence became frequent. He was a guest at their home, offering assistance to their ailing father, speaking with their mother in tones that suggested respect but also calculation. The sisters, unaccustomed to such direct admiration, found themselves caught in currents they could neither control nor resist. For the first time in their lives, the bond that had always shielded them now became the very thing pulling them apart. One evening, beneath the glow of lantern light, Jonathan lingered after supper. Their father had gone to bed, their mother busied herself with mending in the corner, and the sisters sat across from him at the table. His words were casual, yet his eyes betrayed intensity. "You too," he said slowly, as if testing the sound, "are unlike any I've known. 2 lives, 1 face. It is as if God himself split perfection in 2 and set it before me." Mary felt her stomach tighten. Martha flushed with warmth. Neither spoke, but both understood in that moment that their lives were no longer solely their own. The wind rattled the shutters that night as the sisters lay awake in their shared bed. Martha whispered, "He will choose one of us, Mary, and I cannot bear the thought of it not being me." Mary turned away, her eyes stinging with tears she did not allow to fall. "Then you must be prepared to lose me, for if he chooses you, it will be as if he had taken a piece of me as well." Silence stretched between them, heavier than any labor they had ever endured. The bond of their birth, once unshakable, had been touched by the shadow of a man who was not yet theirs, but already claimed too much. And so, as the autumn leaves turned to fire along the Carolina hills, a quiet storm gathered within the farmhouse beneath the sycamores. The town saw only the promise of courtship, the unfolding of romance. But within the hearts of Mary and Martha, an unspoken truth simmered. Love, once introduced, was not a gift they could share without cost. The days shortened as autumn crept in, the fields heavy with harvest, and yet within the Hale household, it was not grain or tobacco that weighed most. It was the silent pull of desire and uncertainty. Jonathan Hale continued to find reasons to linger near the farmhouse of Mary and Martha, whether under the pretense of delivering trade goods, offering to mend a plow, or sharing scripture with their ailing father. To the neighbors, his visits seemed honorable, even generous. But in the close quarters of that farmhouse, the truth grew sharper with every passing evening. The sisters, once inseparable, began to measure their time with him as carefully as one measures silver. If Jonathan asked Mary to fetch water, Martha would insist on joining. If he complimented Martha's stitching, Mary would silently press her hands into her lap until her nails left little crescents upon her skin. It was not spoken between them, for to confess envy was to confess weakness. Yet envy had already taken root. The town gossips thrived on the spectacle. Women at the market would nod knowingly, whispering behind their palms. "It isn't natural," one would say. "2 sisters bound to one man's attention." Another would reply, "Mark my words, such a thing never ends without sorrow." Their words traveled like smoke, curling into the ears of the twins, though neither dared confront them. The whispers hurt most because they rang with a prophecy both sisters feared. Jonathan, for his part, seemed blind, or perhaps indifferent, to the dangerous balance he stirred. He spoke to them as though they were a single entity, his words broad enough to fall upon both yet sharp enough to pierce one more than the other. He admired their unity, but he also exploited it, for in his presence, they felt compelled to outshine one another. Each smile, each shared glance, became a competition fought in silence. It was Mary who first sensed the storm to come. One night, after Jonathan had departed into the crisp autumn dark. She lingered by the window long after Martha had gone to bed. The lantern's flame flickered low, casting shadows upon the wooden walls. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and whispered to herself, "This will end in ruin. I feel it." She turned then, and in the dim light saw Martha watching her from the bed, her eyes glistening with a mixture of fear and longing. Neither spoke. The silence between them had grown heavier than any words could carry. As winter approached, the sisters' father declined further. His cough grew violent, his once strong frame withering before their eyes. Jonathan became an even more constant presence, helping with chores, reading aloud from scripture, even sitting quietly beside the dying man when the sisters were too weary to remain awake. Their mother, too burdened by grief and fatigue, seemed to accept Jonathan's presence as a blessing, though she said little of it aloud. It was during these weeks of sickness and sorrow that the bond between the sisters was most tested. Martha, eager for comfort, clung to Jonathan's words, his steady hands, his broad shoulders. Mary, more guarded, watched with suspicion, convinced that his attentions were not as innocent as they appeared. One evening, after their father had finally succumbed to his illness, the household sat shrouded in grief. Jonathan remained late, offering words of consolation. Martha leaned against him as tears stained her cheeks, while Mary sat rigid across the room, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. That night, as the house fell into a restless sleep, Mary and Martha argued for the first time in earnest. "You let him hold you as though you are already his," Mary hissed, her voice sharp in the darkness. "And why should I not?" Martha snapped back, her own sorrow mingling with anger. "He comforts me. He cares for us when no one else will. Do you not feel it?" "I feel it," Mary replied, her voice breaking. "But I also see it. He divides us, Martha. He drives a wedge into the very place we are most vulnerable." Martha turned her face to the wall, her shoulders trembling. "Perhaps it is not he who divides us, but you who refuses to share what cannot be kept." Mary lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling as the fire in the hearth dwindled to embers. The words cut her deeply because they held a truth she could not deny. In the weeks that followed, their father was buried upon a small hill overlooking the river. The funeral drew neighbors, church members, and acquaintances from nearby towns. Jonathan stood with the family, his hand upon Martha's shoulder, his presence so close it seemed as though he were already one of them. Mary stood beside her sister, her face composed, but inside she raged against a future that seemed to slip from her grasp. It was during the funeral that an old woman from the town, known for her sharp tongue and sharper eyes, muttered just loudly enough for others to hear, "Two sisters cannot share one husband. God did not make marriage to be so twisted. Mark my words, only sorrow will come." The words spread like wildfire, and soon the tale of the twin sisters and the suitor became a favorite among gossips far beyond their small town. Men scoffed at the absurdity, women shook their heads in pity, and the young spoke of it with curiosity. Yet within the farmhouse, the story was not one of amusement but of quiet despair. Jonathan, however, seemed unfazed by the scandal. If anything, he leaned further into his role, declaring his intentions to care for both sisters, to build a future where neither would be left behind. To Martha, his words were salvation. To Mary, they were poison. The winter deepened, bringing with it nights long and cold. The sisters shared the same bed as they always had, but the closeness no longer brought comfort. Their breathing no longer matched in rhythm. Their dreams no longer echoed the same. Each awoke in the night, silent, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, knowing that their bond was unraveling thread by thread. By the time the first signs of spring appeared, the crocus flowers pushing through the thawing earth, the birds returning to their nests, the sisters had become strangers bound by blood but divided by love. Jonathan's presence remained constant, his intentions clearer with every passing day, and yet his choice remained unspoken. The people of the town watched eagerly, waiting for the announcement of an engagement, wondering which sister would be chosen. But neither Mary nor Martha dared speak of it openly, for to do so would mean confronting the truth. that whichever of them was chosen, the other would be left to carry the unbearable weight of loss. And yet, deep within both their hearts, a silent fear grew. What if Jonathan did not choose one over the other? What if he chose them both? The thaw of spring carried both renewal and unease across the land. The river swelled with melted snow, fields drank greedily from the rains, and the townsfolk began their labors anew. Yet in the farmhouse beneath the sycamores, the season did little to cleanse the bitterness that had seeped into Mary and Martha's hearts. Jonathan Hale had become as much a fixture of their lives as the river or the rising sun. His boots scuffed the wooden floor of their home nearly every evening. His laughter echoed in the kitchen, and his presence filled every corner of their small world. He was not merely a guest now. He was a force, one that neither sister could resist nor control. At times, he seemed to favor Mary, drawn to her thoughtful silences and her sharp, discerning mind. He would ask her opinion on matters of scripture or trade, watching her closely as she chose her words with care. Yet, in the very next breath, he would lean toward Martha, praising the nimbleness of her hands or the warmth of her smile. It was as if he took pleasure in balancing upon the knife's edge, testing how far he could stretch their devotion without tearing it apart completely. The sisters bore it differently. Martha clung to every compliment, storing them like jewels against the bleakness of their loss. She laughed at Jonathan's stories, reached for his arm without hesitation, and spoke openly of dreams for a future that included him. Mary, however, grew increasingly withdrawn. She answered his questions with a measured voice, her eyes betraying storms she could not voice aloud. Her silence was not born of indifference but of fear that her heart was already too far entangled, fear that every kindness he showed her sister was a dagger meant for her. The town, ever hungry for drama, watched with sharpened eyes. Rumors spread that Jonathan Hale had made promises to both sisters, that he courted them in equal measure, and that perhaps the family intended to keep them both under one roof. Mothers whispered warnings to their daughters. Preachers thundered against the perversion of such arrangements. And yet the fascination only grew. To the outside world, Mary and Martha were no longer simply sisters. They were a living spectacle, the subject of a tale that seemed destined for tragedy. One evening, under the pale glow of a full moon, Jonathan lingered in the yard with the sisters. The air was fragrant with new blossoms, and the night insects hummed a steady rhythm. He leaned against the fence, his voice low and deliberate. "I have thought much," he said, "about what it means to build a life. Some men seek wealth, others land. I seek something rarer, loyalty, devotion, and the certainty that I will not walk alone in this world." Martha's eyes shone as she listened, certain he spoke to her. Mary, however, felt her chest tighten. His words were broad, meant for both, yet sharp enough to pierce each differently. "Do you mean," Mary asked cautiously, "that you have made your choice?" Jonathan's gaze shifted between them, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, with a faint smile, he replied, "Perhaps my choice is not to divide what was never meant to be divided." The words hung in the air like a curse. Martha gasped softly, her face flushing with hope, while Mary's eyes darkened. Neither dared press him further, for the implication was too heavy, too dangerous to unravel. That night, long after Jonathan had gone, the sisters argued again. "He will not choose," Mary said bitterly, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "He means to bind us both to him, as though we were cattle yoked together. And what if that is the way God intended it?" Martha countered, her voice rising. "We were born together, we have lived together. Why should we not love together?" Mary recoiled as though struck. "Because marriage is not meant to be shared. Because love cannot be divided like bread at supper. One will always have more, and the other will starve." Tears sprang to Martha's eyes, but she held her ground. "Perhaps it is you who cannot bear to share, Mary. Perhaps it is your pride, not God's law, that makes you bitter." They turned away from each other then, lying back to back in their narrow bed, the gulf between them wider than the river itself. Neither slept, though both closed their eyes, pretending to rest while their minds churned with fear, anger, and longing. As weeks passed, Jonathan's visits grew bolder. He no longer waited for invitations but arrived unannounced, his confidence unshaken by gossip or disapproval. The sister's mother, weary and resigned, accepted his presence with little protest. "Better he stays close," she muttered once, "than the girls be left to fend off men with less honorable intentions." But even she could see the danger in his charm, though she lacked the strength to intervene. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the fields, Jonathan took the sisters walking along the riverbank. The water rushed with spring's thaw, foaming white against the rocks. They walked in silence at first, the air heavy with unspoken words. At last, Jonathan stopped, turning to face them both. "You must know," he began, his tone grave, "that the world will never accept what I feel. They will mock, they will curse, they will say it is sin. But I tell you, my heart does not lie. I love you both, and I would sooner defy the world than give up one for the other." Martha's breath caught, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. Mary, however, felt a cold wave wash over her. His declaration, meant as devotion, felt like a sentence, binding them not only to him but to the ruinous path of scandal and division. "That cannot be," Mary whispered, shaking her head. "It will destroy us." Jonathan reached for her hand, then for Martha's, joining them together with his own. "Not destroy," he insisted. "Unite. What God has joined in birth, let no man tear apart in marriage." The river roared at their feet, a fitting chorus to the chaos in their hearts. Martha clung to his words as salvation. Mary felt them as chains. Yet neither could escape, for the bond that had defined their lives now tethered them to a future neither fully desired, yet neither could abandon. As they returned to the farmhouse, their hands still bound in Jonathan's grasp, the first whispers of thunder rolled across the hills. A storm was coming, one that no roof, no prayer, no love could keep at bay. And so the beginning of their tale was set. Two sisters, bound by blood, ensnared by love, and marked by a choice that was never truly theirs to make. The spring of 1839 ripened into a heavy summer, the kind where the air itself seemed to cling to the skin, thick with heat and the smell of earth. Life on the farm demanded endless labor. Fields needed tending, livestock needed care. But beneath the surface of those daily routines, the true work was not of soil or harvest. It was the delicate, dangerous labor of two sisters attempting to live as one while their hearts drifted apart. Mary and Martha had always been more than siblings. Since birth, they had carried an invisible tether, one that stretched across every joy and every sorrow. As children, they had developed a secret language of glances and gestures, a way of communicating that no one else could decipher. When one faltered, the other steadied her. When one cried, the other felt the ache as if her own heart had split. They were, in every sense, two bodies sharing one soul. But now that bond had begun to sour. Their closeness, once a comfort, became a prison. In Jonathan's presence, every glance became a contest, every word a betrayal, every silence a battlefield. The secret language they once shared was now laced with suspicion, each gesture interpreted as an attempt to steal affection. The tether that had always bound them together now pulled them toward destruction. One night, unable to sleep in the stifling heat, Mary rose from their bed and crept outside. The moon hung heavy over the fields, silver light washing the earth in pale silence. She stood barefoot in the grass, breathing in the cool night air, when she heard footsteps behind her. Martha emerged from the doorway, her hair unbound, her face drawn. "You feel it too," Martha whispered, as if confessing a sin. "This tearing inside us, as though our bond itself is fighting to survive." Mary turned to her, her eyes weary. "It is not our bond that fights. It is us. We are the ones tearing it apart." Martha shook her head fiercely. "No, it is Jonathan. He pulls at us. He speaks as though we are one, yet he forces us to be two. I love him, Mary, but I cannot lose you either." Mary's voice trembled with anger and sorrow. "And what if love for him means losing me? Would you choose him still?" Martha's silence was answer enough. She looked away, tears catching the moonlight on her cheeks. For the first time in their lives, the sisters could not find solace in each other's arms. They stood together in the night, yet they were further apart than they had ever been. The weeks that followed were marked by unspoken bitterness. They continued their work side by side, tending crops, sewing garments, carrying water, but their conversations dwindled into necessity. Their mother, though weary and distracted, began to notice the distance. "You girls are like two shadows moving apart," she murmured one morning, her hands shaking as she kneaded dough. "If you let this fester, you will lose more than a man. You will lose yourselves." But warnings did little to ease the growing tension. The bond that had always been their strength was now their greatest torment. Each day, the sisters carried secrets unspoken. Mary harbored jealousy she dared not confess. Martha hid dreams of a future with Jonathan she feared would wound her sister beyond repair. The silence between them was heavy, and in that silence, secrets began to breed. Jonathan, oblivious or unwilling to confront the rift, pressed forward with his strange courtship. He began bringing small gifts, an embroidered ribbon for Martha, a book of sermons for Mary, a pouch of coins for their mother. He spoke of building a larger home, one that might house them all. The sisters listened in strained silence, neither daring to ask the questions that gnawed at their hearts. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west, the sky darkening to a bruised gray. The sisters rushed to gather laundry from the line as thunder cracked across the fields. As they worked, lightning split the sky, and for a moment, both froze, staring at the storm with wide eyes. "Do you remember?" Martha said breathlessly. "When we were children, how you swore the lightning spoke to us?" Mary blinked, caught off guard by the memory. "You laughed at me, said I was foolish. You said it was God's voice, that he spoke only to us because we were one soul split in two." Martha's smile was faint, fragile. "I almost believed you then." Mary looked at her sister, her chest tightening with a mixture of love and despair. "Maybe I was wrong," she said softly. "Maybe it was never God's voice we heard. Maybe it was just the echo of each other. And now the echo is fading." The storm broke then, rain lashing down, forcing them to run for shelter. But the words lingered, carving themselves deep into their hearts. It was around this time that Jonathan began pressing his intentions more firmly. He spoke not of choosing between them, but of creating something unheard of, a household where both sisters would be his wives. He framed it not as sin but as providence, as though their very birth had destined them for this union. Martha clung to the idea desperately, blinded by her longing. But Mary recoiled. She could not reconcile such an arrangement with her faith, her dignity, or the aching truth that love, once divided, became something less than love. The sisters' secret arguments grew more heated. Behind closed doors, they accused one another of betrayal, of selfishness, of weakness. Their words were sharp, their tears bitter. Yet when their mother or neighbors were near, they forced smiles, concealing the fracture that deepened with every passing day. It was during one such quarrel that Martha uttered words she would later regret. "You think you are better than me?" she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "But you are not. You are afraid. Afraid to love, afraid to lose, afraid to live. If you cannot bear Jonathan's love, then step aside and let me have it. For I will not live my life half empty because of you." Mary's face went pale, her hands shaking. "And if I step aside, Martha, what will remain of us? Do you think you can love him and still keep me? You will lose me, just as surely as if I were buried in the ground." Martha turned away, tears spilling freely. "Then perhaps that is the price." The words hung between them, cruel and irreversible. For the first time, Mary felt the tether between them snap. Not fully, but enough to wound, enough to bleed. And yet, even as anger and jealousy tore at them, the bond of their blood would not break entirely. For beneath their bitterness lay a truth neither could deny. They were still one soul in two bodies. Their love and their hatred were bound together, inseparable, as though fate itself refused to let them go. The summer dragged on, thick with heat, secrets, and the unrelenting question of what future awaited them. And as the cicadas droned in the trees and the crops ripened in the fields, the sisters carried their bond like a curse and a blessing both. A secret tether that no man, no love, and no betrayal could fully sever. The heat of July lay heavy over the fields, a suffocating weight that pressed on lungs and minds alike. The crops thrived under the sun, yet inside the farmhouse, the atmosphere grew increasingly unbearable. Mary and Martha moved about their chores with the practiced precision of habit, but the easy rhythm they once shared was gone. Every gesture seemed deliberate, every silence filled with unspoken accusations. Jonathan's presence had become nearly constant. Neighbors raised eyebrows at his boldness, but he brushed aside their mutterings with a confident smile. He worked beside the sisters in the fields, shared their meals, even lingered into the late hours as though the farmhouse already belonged to him. The town clucked its tongues, but Jonathan was a man unbothered by scandal. One evening, as fireflies rose from the grass like sparks from unseen embers, Jonathan gathered the sisters in the yard. His tone was serious, his eyes reflecting both determination and desire. "I cannot choose between you," he said, his voice steady. "And I will not. To favor one would be to betray the other, and in doing so betray myself. I love you both, and I believe God brought you into this world as two halves of the same whole. I mean to honor that. I mean to marry you both." The words struck like thunder. Martha gasped, covering her mouth with trembling hands, her eyes shining with both shock and forbidden hope. Mary's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding with a mixture of rage and terror. "You cannot speak of such things," Mary said, her voice sharp. "Marriage is not a game to be twisted. It is sacred. One man, one woman. That is the law of God and man alike." Jonathan's gaze softened, though his resolve did not falter. "Laws are written by men, and men are flawed. What I feel is greater than their judgment. I would defy them all if it meant keeping you both by my side." Martha stepped forward then, her face flushed with emotion. "And if it were possible, Mary, would you not choose the same? To be together, always, even in love?" Mary turned on her sister, her eyes blazing. "You speak as though love can be divided without loss. But it cannot. What you ask would break us. You would share a man's touch, a man's heart, as though it were a loaf of bread to be split between us. That is not love. It is ruin." The silence that followed was suffocating. Jonathan stood unyielding, Martha trembled with desperate hope, and Mary felt herself unravel. That night, when they lay side by side in their narrow bed, the air between them was charged with tension. Martha whispered into the darkness, her voice raw with longing. "I would rather share him than lose him altogether. If you loved me truly, Mary, you would see that." Mary closed her eyes, her body rigid. "If you loved me truly, you would not ask me to destroy myself." Neither slept. The crickets sang, the river whispered beyond the fields, and the bond that had once sustained them strained against the weight of choices too heavy for any heart to bear. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan's proposal became more than words. He began to make plans, drawing sketches of a larger home, speaking of land he intended to purchase, even consulting a traveling preacher rumored to be lenient in his views. The townsfolk, upon hearing whispers of his intentions, erupted in outrage. "An abomination," the minister declared from the pulpit one Sunday. "A mockery of holy union." Mothers pulled their daughters closer when Jonathan passed. Men spat at his feet. Yet within the farmhouse, Jonathan's resolve only hardened. He spoke of destiny, of providence, of a love too rare to be constrained by ordinary rules. Martha clung to his vision, her hope swelling like a tide she could not resist. Mary, meanwhile, felt the walls closing in, her heart caught between loyalty to her sister and her own desperate need for freedom. Every night, as the cicadas wailed in the trees, the sisters whispered arguments in the dark. Their bond, once unbreakable, was fraying, each thread stretched thinner by love, jealousy, and the terrible secret of Jonathan's plan. And though neither dared admit it aloud, both knew that something within their world was reaching a breaking point. For secrets, once born, do not remain hidden forever. And the bond of blood, once tested, can either endure or it can shatter beyond repair. The sisters' quarrels began to seep into the fabric of daily life. What once had been gentle laughter during morning chores turned into silence sharp enough to cut. When one spoke, the other responded with clipped words or cold glances. Their parents noticed but said little. After all, daughters were expected to quarrel and mend quickly. But this rift was different. It ran deeper than childhood bickering. Martha spent more and more time by the river with Jonathan, speaking in hushed tones, dreaming aloud about futures where scandal could not touch them. She painted pictures of wide fields, a warm hearth, and children with his eyes. Mary often watched from the distance, her chest tight with a mix of fury and grief. She knew her sister's dreams too well. They had once been her own. One evening, while their mother kneaded dough and their father mended a gate, Mary confronted Jonathan outside the barn. The sunset blazed behind her, painting the sky in fire. "You will destroy us," she said flatly. "Whatever spell you have woven over Martha, I beg you to release her. Leave us before the shame of your plans consumes our family." Jonathan did not flinch. He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "I cannot release her, for I love her. And you may hate me for it, Mary, but I will not lie. I love you both. To leave would be to sever my own soul." Mary's jaw tightened. "Then you are selfish beyond measure. Or brave," he countered softly. The words lingered in her mind long after he walked away, gnawing at her resolve. For though she despised his boldness, she could not deny the dangerous pull of his charm. That night, Martha reached for her hand beneath the quilt. Her grip was trembling, desperate. "Promise me, Mary," she whispered. "Promise me you will not fight him. If you love me, let this happen." Mary lay still, staring into the darkness. Her heart screamed to refuse, but her lips would not form the words. The silence became its own kind of answer. And so, in the quiet corners of their world, an unholy pact began to take shape. The twins, once bound by innocence, were now bound by a secret they dared not speak aloud. Jonathan's shadow fell across them both, and though only one welcomed it with joy, the other could not find the strength to drive it away. It was only a matter of time before that shadow swallowed the sisters whole. Autumn rolled into North Carolina with crisp winds and fields painted gold. Harvest season brought neighbors together in wagon trains of corn, pumpkins, and sorghum. Yet beneath the laughter and hymns, whispers curled like smoke. The twins and their suitor, Jonathan, stubborn as ever, did not relent. By September, he had secured a parcel of land at the edge of the river. On it, he built a modest cabin with his own hands, chopping the timber, splitting the shingles, hammering until his palms blistered. He worked with a fever that unsettled the townsfolk. Was it for Mary or for Martha? For both? No one dared ask aloud, but everyone wondered. When the day of decision finally came, it was not marked by a preacher's blessing or a gathering at the chapel. Instead, it unfolded quietly, almost defiantly. At dusk, under a sky streaked with violet, Jonathan led both sisters into the new cabin. He had asked a traveling minister, one whispered to turn a blind eye to unusual unions, to officiate a ceremony that skirted the edges of respectability. The minister read from his worn Bible, his voice wavering as he glanced nervously at the twin brides. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, but the blessing felt hollow, as though heaven itself hesitated to listen. Still, Jonathan declared it done. Mary and Martha were now his wives. For Martha, the moment glittered like sunlight on water. She clung to Jonathan's arm, her face radiant with triumph, as though love had conquered all. For Mary, it was a nightmare sealed in Scripture. She felt herself drift as the words were spoken, as if her soul hovered outside her body, watching in disbelief as she was bound to a man she had begged to leave. Word spread through the valley with lightning speed. By morning, Neighbors stood at their gates, muttering darkly. The preacher at the local chapel condemned the union from his pulpit, thundering about sin and abomination. Mothers clutched their daughters tighter. Men shook their heads with contempt. Yet Jonathan walked through town with his wives at his side, unbowed by their scorn. "Let them talk," he told Martha one evening as she tended the fire. "What matters is that we have carved our own path. The world can burn for all I care, so long as you two stand with me." But in Mary's heart, a question festered. Did she truly stand with him, or had she merely been pulled into a current too strong to resist? The cabin walls soon echoed with both laughter and quarrels, tenderness and bitterness. The sisters, once inseparable, now lived in the same house with a husband who belonged to both and to neither. And while the world judged from afar, the real battle raged within the fragile walls of that home. The first nights in the cabin were filled with uneasy silence, broken only by the pop of firewood and the cry of owls beyond the river. Martha moved about with eager energy, arranging quilts, placing wildflowers in a jar, humming softly as if trying to drown out the tension. For her, the cabin was a dream finally realized. A home, a husband, and a future she had longed for. Mary, however, felt like a trespasser in her own life. Every corner of the cabin seemed to remind her of a bargain she had never truly agreed to. She lay awake at night, listening to Jonathan's even breathing beside her, while Martha's body curled close on the other side. It was a strange, suffocating triangle of warmth and distance. Three souls bound together, yet each carrying their own solitude. Jonathan, for his part, behaved as though nothing about their union was unusual. He split wood at dawn, worked the fields by day, and sat at the table in the evenings, praising the meal as though they were any ordinary family. When he reached for Martha's hand, Mary's stomach twisted. When he brushed Mary's shoulder in passing, Martha's smile faltered. The neighbors, though they pretended to avoid gossip, found ways to keep the story alive. At the general store, old Mrs. Tuttle shook her head, whispering that no good would come from such a godless arrangement. Young men sneered when Jonathan walked by, muttering insults about his pride. Even those who pitied the sisters did not dare speak in their defense. Inside the cabin, the sisters' bond continued to strain. Martha's joy made her bold, and sometimes reckless. She teased Mary about Jonathan's gaze, laughed about sharing tasks as sister wives, and spoke of children with a glint of hope in her eyes. Mary, stung by every word, began to withdraw into herself, burying her anger beneath quiet chores and long walks by the river. One evening, as rain battered the roof and wind rattled the shutters, Martha cornered her sister near the hearth. "Why do you always look at me as if I've stolen something?" she demanded. "This life is ours, Mary. Not just mine, ours. Jonathan belongs to both of us." Mary stared into the flames, her jaw tight. "A heart cannot be split without breaking. And one day, Martha, you will see that." The words hung heavy between them, heavier even than the storm raging outside. For though the cabin now stood firm against wind and rain, within its walls a storm far more dangerous was already brewing. One born of jealousy, love, and the fragile thread holding three lives together.